Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And welcome back to Chapter 3 of Wallowing in Watergate. Before I start, I just wanted to ask, did anybody have questions or concerns or issues from our last class that we didn't get a chance to discuss last week?
Can I make an editorial comment?
You weren't here.
Sure.
I was here. I was here.
Oh, okay. Whose word is? Oh, it was the next one you missed.
You're wearing Cal shirt.
Go ahead, Bob.
This might be one of the more interesting courses I've ever taken from yet.
Yeah.
Just before, seriously.
Okay.
Because I think we were all there at the time, and we're kind of remembering parts of it, but we didn't get a first-hand perspective. And I think that's what's so important about many of our courses is that we hear from people who were there and who did there and done that, whatever.
Been in the room, they were in the room.
And I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
And you can tell because you're not losing people. Look at this, the room is full. It can't be much fuller.
Okay, good. Well, that's actually, thank you. That's very nice to hear.
Are you going to tell them that you made up most of the stuff?
No, he was listening to you.
I expect an A now.
So those newspaper article pictures are photoshopped, right?
Shop them all in.
From now on, I'm gonna start calling him Art.
All right, well, this morning we're going to talk about the hearings. We're going to get into the hearings themselves. And specifically, we're going to focus on our very quick investigation, the hearings, and some key witnesses at the beginning. And we're going to take it all the way up to the discovery of the tapes. And we're going to save the discovery of the tapes for next week, along with the Saturday Night Massacre and Nixon's resignation. And we're going to save some time next week to have a discussion about the implications. Did the system work, or were we just lucky? How comparing then to now and what's changed. Some comparisons possibly of Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. And more of a free flow for the last half of next week's session. But that's our plan. We don't have session 5. Next week will be our last class.
There's Bill.
And there's Bill. So let's move on. Okay, so here I want you to see a picture of what we look like back in those days.
Young little babies. Was that you?
Yeah, in case you have trouble distinguishing, the person on the right is me, and the person on the left is Mary.
Did you sing with Paul Simon?
No, that's
Dark.
No, you'll see
Did you
later
sing
on.
with Paul Simon?
He hasn't gotten a haircut yet, but it gets worse.
Yes,
Right.
that's after Mary took the part out of my hair, which she claimed was looking like a bullet had been shot through my hair. Now, I wanted to focus on this before we got to the hearings because my first day of work was literally 3 weeks before the hearings were scheduled to begin. And I was in law school on Friday, and then I was in committee staff on Monday. My boss had said, get to work by 8:30 in the morning, no later than that. So I showed up dutifully down in the auditorium at G308 at 8:30 to find it was locked.
He locks him out.
So,
What do you expect?
and my boss was nowhere to be found, which I discovered was, he usually rolled in about 9:30 or 10, but we should get there at 8:30. So a guard told me that I should go up to the chief counsel's office, which was on the first floor. So I did, and they let me in the office and told me that they were going to have a meeting, but it wasn't going to start for another half hour. So I walked out of that office into the hallway at the Dirksen Senate office building, and I get accosted immediately by this very attractive blonde woman who says, I'm Leslie Stahl from CBS. What's going on in there? And I think, oh my goodness. And I said, I have no idea. It's my first day of work. I introduced myself. And I wandered back down with one of the administrators to find my little garret. It's partly pictured in that picture downstairs in the Senate auditorium. Terry rolled in and said, well, after this meeting at Sam's office, we have to run out to National Airport because I've got a really important witness. So Terry and I go to the executive committee meeting and we talk about what the witness list should be for the first week of hearings. Terry then says, let's go. We're going out to the airport. We got to meet this guy at 1 o'clock. We drive out to the airport. We walk into the TWA concourse where we're supposed to be in the second bay going out to the airline. And as you know, there's no security at that point. There's nothing we have to get through. So we go out to the second bay in the concourse. And about a half an hour later, a very stocky man with slick back hair and a trench coat comes walking down and looks up and says, "Oh, are you Terry?" And Terry. Turns out it's Tony Ulasewicz. Terry had been out on the West Coast the previous week. He'd interviewed Herb Kalmbach, who was President Nixon's lawyer, and who was the money man for paying off the burglars.
The hush money.
With hush money, basically, or cash for living expenses. And Kalmbach had identified this fellow, Tony Ulasewicz, as being the bag man. So Terry and I are interviewing him at the TWA concourse in an open hallway. And he says, yeah, well, you know, I used the airport for drops for each of the defendants. Do you want to see where I used the drops?
Just a reminder, 24 hours earlier, Black was at law school. He doesn't know. Okay.
So we go.
What's a
We
drop?
go walking around National Airport to the different phone booths. As you know, there were phone booths back in those days, which he used as drops for the defendants and spouses. And Tony shows us 3 or 4 of the phone booths, which are drops.
Wait a minute, you mean he had money in a bag?
He had money in a bag that he would leave in the phone booth, call the designated person who was then going to pick it up as soon as he left the phone booth. And so, I mean, my jaw is sort of dragging along the floor of the airport as we're walking around, and I'm thinking, God, this is amazing. And Terry, who's discovered this, is saying, pretty interesting. And I go, yeah, pretty interesting.
So were you able to record that, or just the fact that you had 2 of you, that was adequate?
I'm sorry?
Were you able to record the conversation?
We didn't. What we did was I recorded a summary of it afterwards, and we took careful notes. And then, well, what our process was, we would do an interview. Afterwards, we would record a summary. We'd give the summary to the research assistants, who would then break it into bits that would go into the computer that would then spit out a chronology or a witness list or a subject topic list. And so that's what we're going to do with this one as well.
So Mark, why was Tony so willing to speak so
Thank you,
freely
Doug.
about
That's my
this?
question.
On that,
No, why was Tony Ulasewicz so willing, so cooperative?
he is a former New York City policeman. He's very proud of what he had done for the White House.
We'll hear that later on.
We're going to get to him a little bit later, but he got hired initially by Jack Caulfield in the White House as an outside investigator for $22,000 a year in the spring of 1969. And Ulasewicz, after Chappaquiddick, Caulfield said, get up to Chappaquiddick and find out what happened. And so Tony was actually the very first private investigator on the scene. So he was very proud of what he had done.
Yes, but just a back note. He has nothing to do with Chappaquiddick. He's not officially investigating anything.
No.
He's gathering information because there was an appetite that couldn't be satisfied regarding the Kennedys. And here was one more event that they were going to get the first back.
First intelligence on.
Right.
But he also didn't think he'd committed any crimes.
But don't get thrown out.
Yeah. Anyway, so we finish up Tony mid-afternoon at National Airport. We drive back to the office. My head is kind of spinning. And we walk into the office, and my colleague Scott Armstrong comes over and said, "What did you hear the news? Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dick Kleindienst have all resigned, and they fired John Dean." I thought, this is like 4 o'clock in the
They
afternoon.
heard you were coming.
And I thought, well, I've had a big impact my first day of work. So I remember I called one of my roommates at law school just because I'd forgotten some stuff and I needed to be set down. And he said, "Well, how are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I feel a little bit like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You know, I'm not in law school anymore." Anyway, I wanted to offer that just because we had 3 weeks to prepare for public hearings. We didn't know a lot at that point. We didn't really know where it was going to go. And we didn't have a lot of time to figure it out because Senator Ervin was very focused on getting hearings started by May 17th. I think it was because of when the resolution by the Senate got passed to create the committee. Anyway, it was a pretty eventful, the reason I'm sure I remember it so clearly, it was an incredibly eventful day for me. It was my first day out of school, my first job.
You were still in school, you just weren't attending.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Can we go to the video?
Yeah, let's go to this video now.
There was some newspaper reporting suggesting perhaps White House involvement, but it was all suggestion. There was no evidence, no indication that could establish any relationship. Our investigation began there.
Fred Thompson, a political friend of Howard Baker's from Tennessee, was the minority counsel. This young Republican came to Washington thinking the hearings would last only about a month and assuming there wouldn't be much evidence of wrongdoing among the higher-ups at the White House.
Well, when I started, I hoped and believed that the hearings would clear up any questions about who was involved and who was not involved, and I certainly believe that at that time there was no reason to believe the president or any of the people who had responsible positions under the president were involved.
Dash and Thompson recruited a staff of investigators. They worked around the clock in crowded offices in the Senate basement, sorting out a tangle of leads and interviewing prospective witnesses. Gradually, they began to piece together a complex and bizarre story of diverted campaign funds, wiretaps, and still more burglaries. Early on, a dispute developed over the order of witnesses to be put on the stand in the caucus room.
And there was some sentiment for calling the big names first and getting it out and really kind of going to the horse's mouth, the Haldemans, the Ehrlichmans, and the Mitchells, and really find out what was there, if anything, and getting it over with. I think there was a lot of sentiment that this was something that, for the sake of the nation and everyone else, should not be dragged on forever. So there was some thought to doing that. Senator Baker, I think, initially favored that approach. Some others on the Democratic side, Sam Dash, I think primarily wanted to go.
I wanted to stop it for just a second because Fred understates it. It was clear that the White House and the Republicans wanted the biggest witnesses to testify first. Dash and Senator Ervin, to their credit, said, no, this is something we got to build from the bottom up. Because if we don't know and when we talk to the big witnesses, if we don't know what the story is, our interviews are not going to be very effective. So we had a vote in the committee, and curiously, when we needed 2/3 vote of the committee to approve this, Senator Weicker voted with the Democrats. Senator Weicker was a moderate Republican from Connecticut, and he voted with the Democrats. And as soon as Senator Baker realized that he didn't have the votes to block it, he made it unanimous. And so to the public, it was all bipartisan and unanimous. But internally, it was very contentious. Fred sort of underplayed that a fair amount.
Now, Trina, I might need your help. I don't know if it's going to pick up or we're going to just.
I'll pay attention.
All right, so we need to hit the back arrow, but then start at community.
Yeah, I think it's starting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's the wrong one. So can you get us back to Fred? Yes, scooch it along.
There was some newspaper reporting suggesting perhaps White House involvement.
I thought that's where you left off.
No, we left off with Fred talking, so that's Sam saying we don't know anything, and that's right.
Okay, that's
And then-
interesting because it was partly. Oh, I see, because you
And
didn't.
then go back,
Yeah.
go back.
I forgot you
go
didn't
back.
start at the beginning.
And so that's getting,
Keep going.
right, to stop at Fred, okay, Fred. Do I,
And after discussion, that was the way in which the committee decided to proceed.
May 17, 1973. After the 2 frantic months of preparation, the hearings began. The 3 commercial networks and public television were there with live coverage. These would become the most extensively televised congressional hearings before or since. Scott Armstrong, a committee investigator, remembers the shock when he walked into the room.
That first day when we walked into the hearing room and suddenly saw all those cameras, it was a circus that we hadn't expected. I think all of us somewhat recoiled from the notion that the kind of public scrutiny that was going to be given us and the committee and the way in which it looked into the White House, it made us very self-conscious and wondering if we were fully prepared.
At 10:02 a.m., Senator Ervin brought down the gavel.
The aim of the committee is to provide full and open public testimony in order that the nation can proceed towards the healing of the...
I don't want that. So let's go to the next slide.
Let's
We haven't done
hold
it
for a
yet.
second, yeah.
Right, there we go.
So what we decided to do was to be very low-key at the beginning. We had an obvious first critical witness in James McCord that I'm going to get to in the next slide or two. But what we wanted to do was first to sort of establish a tone of seriousness and non-sensationalism by focusing on who were the players, who were the people, what was the organization. 1 on the White House and 2 on CREEP. And so we called an administrator from the White House, Bruce Curleye, and the administrator for CREEP, who was a fellow named Rob Odell. And Rob was the very first witness and merely outlined the organizational structure of what CREEP looked like, who the players were, and very low key. And the idea was to get into the story after we introduced the players, if that makes any sense.
Right, and I just want to add on that again, as we're going in, the only stuff we actually know about are the burglaries. We know there's been a burglary. We know their names. We know that that's been in the newspapers. That's really all we really knew. We didn't know any of the other stuff. So again, the early witnesses gave us also time investigatively to stay out in the field and build the rest of the story.
Right. No, the problem was walking and chewing gum at the same time, which I've struggled with most of my life. Yeah, so let's go ahead too.
Well, this is James McCoy, but what we've missed is the opening day, and I want to get back to that because it was exciting. Can we get back to our video where Irvin's gaveling? It's the one I.
Oh, no, that's it.
Good. That's not right.
That's it. Yeah.
Break-in strike at the very undergirding of our democracy. If the many allegations made to this date are true,
Sorry, I don't know why that.
then the burglars who broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate were in effect breaking into the home of every citizen of the United States. And if these allegations proved to be true, what they were seeking to steal was not the jewels, money, or other property of American citizens, but something much more valuable, their most precious heritage, the right to vote in a free election.
We will inquire into every fact and follow every lead, unrestrained by any fear of where that lead might ultimately take us.
Okay, that what we were able to do was just limit opening statements to the chairman and the ranking minority member rather than have everybody give a long statement, because Senate hearings tend to go on and on and on with senators giving statements rather than getting evidence or facts into the record. So we tried to move it along that way. Our goal was basically initially to outline the break-in and the cover-up. So our early witnesses, our early witnesses were basically the police officers that caught the burglars and a few other schedulers and people like that that could sort of talk about how things worked and where things were. But our first critical witness was a fellow named James McCord. And James McCord was not only the head of security for the committee to re-elect the president, he had recently retired from the CIA. And he was also the wire man, a guy that actually put the wiretap into Larry O'Brien's phone. And so that's why he was critical, but he was caught inside the Watergate with the other burglars. He went to trial and was convicted. He and Gordon Liddy were the only ones that went to trial. The other ones all pled guilty beforehand. But McCord, in March, when he was about to get sentenced by Judge Sirica said to the defendants that he didn't think that they had been very forthcoming in terms of discussing who hired them, what the purpose was, and so on. McCord then wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, which Judge Sirica read in court out loud in late March, saying that the defendants had been pressured to stay silent. They'd been given money, and witnesses had perjured themselves in the trial. And he thought it was important to say that. He also did it because it was going to lessen his own sentence, he thought. So we immediately had an ideal first witness, in a sense, because this fellow, McCord, not only related the burglars to Creep, he also related the burglars to the White House, because who applied pressure on him? A fellow named Jack Caulfield, who was a White House employee, and who was Caulfield reporting to a fellow named John Dean, who was the White House counsel. So it was the first opportunity to sort of link both the committee to re-elect the president and the White House with the burglars and potentially the cover-up. So let's listen to a little bit to McCord's testimony.
Political pressure from the White House was conveyed to me in January 1973 by John Caulfield to remain silent, take executive clemency by going off to prison quietly, and I was told that while there I would receive financial aid and later rehabilitation and a job. I was further told in a January meeting in 1973 with Caulfield that the President of the United States was aware of our meeting, that the results of the meeting would be conveyed to the President, and that at a future meeting there would likely be a personal message from the President himself.
Okay, I think that's what we have.
Why, after a lifetime of work as a law enforcement officer, without, as you've testified, any blemish on your career, did you agree with Mr. Liddy to engage in his program of burglaries and illegal wiretapping, and specifically the two break-ins on May 30 and June 17th at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate?
There were a number of reasons associated with the ultimate decision of mine to do so. One of the reasons, and a very important reason to me, was the fact that the Attorney General himself, Mr. John Mitchell, at his offices had considered and approved the operation, according to Mr. Liddy. Secondly, that the counsel for the President, Mr. John Dean, had participated in those decisions with him, that one was a top legal officer for the United States in the Department of Justice, and the second gentleman was a top legal officer in the White House.
Okay, now that's a picture of Jack Caulfield. it got in here. I'm not quite sure how.
This is a little bit of a glitch. I don't know how, the technical person isn't so
He
great.
asked what my plans were regarding talking publicly, and I said that I planned to do so when I was ready, that I had discussed it with my wife, and she said that I should do what I felt I must and not to worry about the family. I advised Jack that my children were now grown and could understand what I had to do when the disclosures came out. He responded by saying, quote, "You know that if the administration gets its back to the wall, it will have to take steps to defend itself."
Now, this is the very first crack that we had in the wall of silence that had prevailed among all the burglars and Hunt and Liddy and all the way up the line for the cover-up. No one had suggested at that point anything about payments or pressure or executive clemency, or that the president was aware of these conversations. And lots of it wasn't true. It's pretty clear that President Nixon was not aware of Caulfield's offers to McCord, but McCord thought that he was, which is probably more important.
Wasn't there something else in McCord's background that he wanted?
Well, the other thing is that he'd been a career employee. Yeah, thank you. He'd been a career employee of the CIA. He was very proud of his service of the CIA, and he was very supportive of what the CIA does and did. And at the time, he was told that the administration was going to blame the whole burglary on the CIA. And as far as he was concerned, that was an outrage because it was going to damage the reputation of the institution that he'd worked for his entire career. So he basically threatened early on in one of his conversations with Caulfield. He said, look, if they're going to try and blame this on the CIA, then all the trees in the forest are going to, his language was, all the trees in the forest are going to fall, meaning all these other folks are going to be exposed. Thanks to McCord. This was at the time very shocking testimony because nobody had suggested either that President Nixon was aware of this or that anybody from the White House was involved in doing this. Jack Caulfield was a White House employee at the time. He's a former police officer for New York City and had been the head of security in Nixon's 1968 campaign. He had then been brought into the White House to do special projects for John Ehrlichman, which is where he hired Tony Ulasewicz as an outside investigator to help out and not have a direct line back to the White House. In fact, when he hired Ulasewicz, he said, we're going to call you Mr. Stanley so that nobody knows who you really are, which I found that one kind of surprising, but
Just like
apparently it happens all the time. And
so let's meet Jack.
so let's meet Jack Caulfield. This is Jack Caulfield, former New York City policeman.
And my first question to you very simply is this, to use your own words. I'd like you to comment or explain to me why it is that you thought that you were doing a great service for the President of the United States.
Well, sir, if you go back a little bit, it was a great honor for me to serve as a member of the President's staff. I had come from a rather humble background, police officer. I did receive this great opportunity to serve on the President's staff. I felt very strongly about the President, extremely strongly about the President. I was very loyal to his people that I worked for. I place a high value upon loyalty. Now, out of the blue, I'm injected into this scandal. I'm being asked by one of my former superiors to deliver a message that I know to be executive clemency. I tried to avoid it, as my statement indicates. I imposed upon my friend to do it, hoping that all parties would be satisfied. I was not successful. I was brought back in again to it, now being asked to see Mr. McCord directly. I did go to see him. Now I'm becoming further implicated into this matter. I have this conversation with John Dean, who's the counsel to the president. I've been there 3 years. I know what the relations are and how they exist. I make certain judgments based upon those relationships. In my mind, I felt that the president probably did know about it.
Now, isn't it remarkable how rationalization takes the form that it does? And he's trying to explain his conflict between his loyalty, his obligations of loyalty, and sort of knowing that he's participating in something that's not particularly kosher.
What isn't clear in his testimony is that what he's being asked to do is talk to the defendants about the hush money. In this particular segment, it's not explained, but for us to understand, that's what he's making a reference to. And he doesn't want to do it, and they ask him to do it not once, but twice.
Right, they asked him to go back after the January meeting, they asked him to go back again and make another pitch to McCord that, you know, the White House isn't happy with McCord. McCord is a stubborn old bird who's been convicted and is going to get sentenced.
And he's busted them. He's busted them all.
Yes.
Right.
So in essence, since Caulfield knows he's going to be implicated in this scandal, he reaches out to his buddy Tony, who we've just interviewed, and I talked a little bit about the interview of Tony showing us the drafts as the bagman. And
couldn't have been that picture. It's the picture.
And I should add that, you know, every drama needs a Falstaff or a Falstaffian figure. And after Terry and I interviewed Tony, we thought he would be perfect as this Falstaffian figure. And not only that, but we see the line that goes up to John Dean, and we realize Dean has been fired. And at the same time this is going on, Sam Dash is meeting with John Dean and his lawyer alone, without any of the rest of us or without the Republicans, to hear about what Dean can testify to, because Dean wants to get immunity from us so that he can't get prosecuted by the U.S. attorney.
Going back to what Maggie asked about, did you have a witness, did you record it, blah, blah, blah. Here's Sam Dash on his own. He's not bringing any Republicans with him. He's going right now to see if he can't find out what the guy's going to say to get him the immunity. But we're back to Tony. We haven't heard from Tony.
No, let's run what Tony. I think when you hear Tony testify, you get a flavor for the kind of person he was and what he had to offer. And Terry Linson does the questioning here. He was our boss.
The committee will come to order, and counsel will call the first witness.
Mr. Tony Ulasewicz.
You were sworn in. You took the oath of a witness when you were here before the committee before, and this same oath still covers your testimony.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Terry Lenzner, Assistant Chief Counsel, will question the witness.
Smile.
Mr. Ulasewicz, I see you have counsel today. Would you identify yourself, please, sir?
John Joseph Sutter, Mineola, New York.
And I understand you have a brief statement you'd like to make, Mr. Sutter.
I do. Mr. Chairman, I'm sure much to the relief of the committee, Mr. Ulasewicz does not have a prepared statement he desires to read. He is here merely for the purposes of answering questions from the committee, and I should like the record to indicate that he appears pursuant to a subpoena issued by the committee dated April 30, 1973, and served upon him on or about May 8, 1973. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sutter. Mr. Ulasewicz, you testified here about your relationships with Mr. Caulfield and making contact with Mr. McCord. I just want to go back and ask you, were you contacted originally by Mr. Caulfield in February of 1969 with reference to doing some investigative work?
Yes, I was.
Now, I understand the committee is not going to inquire into that area in any detail at all today, but I do want to just ask two other background questions. One, were you also interviewed by Mr. John Ehrlichman in May of 1969 at the VIP lounge at LaGuardia Airport?
That is correct.
And in June of 1969, did you meet Mr. Herbert Kalmbach here in the District of Columbia?
That is correct.
Now, on or about June 28, 1972, did you receive a call from that same Mr. Kalmbach?
Yes, I believe it was on the 29th of June.
And could you tell us what he said to you and what you said to him?
Mr. Kalmbach asked me to come down to Washington the next afternoon, that he wanted to speak to me regarding an assignment.
And did you agree to do that?
Yes, I did.
And did you see him the next day?
I did.
Where was that, sir?
It was in the Statler Hilton Hotel in his room.
And can you tell us what he said to you at that time and what you said to him?
Mr. Kalmbach advised me that he had a very important assignment, and he went at least 3 times over a statement saying that it was a situation that developed that he was asked to do something and needed my help in doing it. He said that it was legal, that it was to provide funds for persons in difficulty, for payment of their counsels, and for a payment to assist their families during some troublesome period. He repeated the statement several times. He was very ill at ease, very nervous, and we got to the point when I said, well, Mr. Kalmbach, just what is this now? And he says, well, I guess you have guessed it, that it's the Watergate situation.
Mr. Ulasewicz, let me just interrupt. Could you put the microphone more directly in front of you, sir, please? Thank you.
And he said, it's the Watergate situation. I guess you've guessed that. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, again, let me assure you that I would not in any way or fashion ask anyone to do anything that I wouldn't engage my own services in. It is an assignment for me, and I'm asking you to do this. It will necessitate confidential methods, possibly. He couldn't go into, at that time, as to what it might completely take in. At a certain point in the conversation, he mentioned that there may be a necessity of communicating by telephone with me from time to time and what might be the best procedures. I said, if you mean as far as best procedures of eavesdropping or anything of that type, that the telephone booth method is the only one, and I started to explain that, however, wherever you want me to call you, you should give me the number in advance. You should check it out, know where I'm calling, and then I do it in return, and that went right over his head, actually, because it didn't quite work out that way, but we went into the phone booth deal, and we agreed to it. After that...
Would you explain what the phone booth deal was, Mr. Ulasewicz?
Well, that if he wanted to be absolutely certain of receiving a call at a cleared phone booth or so, he should have, the way it would be with go into an area where he wanted me to call from a phone booth and establish that it was actually a phone booth. But we did make an arrangement later where I did furnish him with numbers.
A phone booth.
So we now have a clear story about what's going on with the cover-up. And it turns out that Ulasewicz subsequently was prosecuted for tax fraud because he was paid money in cash by the White House that he didn't report on his tax return. So and I believe he got a suspended sentence. But in any case, in terms of the hearings, we were able to establish pretty clearly that there was a cover-up going on and money being exchanged and phone booth deals being done. What's interesting, I think, about Tony's testimony is he talks to Kalmbach, and Kalmbach assures him that everything is legal. Kalmbach told us, when we interviewed him the second time, he told the story about when Ehrlichman had asked Kalmbach to provide funds to support the defendants' families. Kalmbach looked at Ehrlichman and said, John, you and I have known each other for a number of years. Our wives know each other. We've been friends socially, blah, blah, blah. Is this on the up and up? And Kalmbach said, John assured him that everything was on the up and up. Now you ask yourself, how does somebody suspend their own judgment in these circumstances? Is it because they're so infatuated with power and status and the trappings of all that they sort of forget about their own judgment, ethical judgment? But Ulasewicz asked Caulfield the same thing, and Caulfield assures Tony that it's all on the up and up. Now, if it's all on the up and up, why do you use phone booths and obscure phone numbers and cash? These are not checks. These are $100 bills in brown paper bags. Literally, he's leaving $25,000 in $100 bills in phone booths at National Airport for people. This is not the way support usually works. I mean, usually support is a little bit. Yeah, it's not. Yes.
You said that he was later convicted of tax fraud, the cash money that he was receiving from the White House.
Yes.
Where that money came in the White House, from where, and how was that recorded there? Like if they convicted him, somebody else should have been responsible.
Kalmbach had the money that he then dispersed to Tony.
Eleanor is asking, and where did Kalmbach get that money?
Kalmbach got the money from an account that he had at a bank in California where they took some of the political contributions that they had.
It's campaign finance, but that was also when I talked last week about Hughes Rebozo. There were other sources of cash that had nothing to do with campaign finance, that just cash coming in. So here we go. Let's hear what Judd has to say.
No, let's not go to his testimony yet, because this gets on the other side. So on the one hand, we have a clear pattern that we've been able to establish relatively early of cash payments and drops being made for the cover-up. What we still don't have very well established is what this gemstone plan was in terms of involving break-ins, putting spies in other campaigns, sending pizzas to campaign fundraisers, and so on, and kidnapping radicals near their convention. So Jeb Magruder was the deputy campaign manager for the committee to re-elect the president. And he had approved the gemstone plan and brought it to John Mitchell. And so we were able to interview him and hear his testimony. Curiously, afterwards, after we finished the interview, I was the second with Terry on the interview. He turned to me and said, well, now I've got a business trip planned for next week to Italy. Is it okay to go? And I started to nod my head that it was fine. And Terry interrupted me and literally put a hand over my mouth and said, no, you're not going to go to that. You're going to testify. So let's hear a little bit of Jeb Magruder's testimony.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
No.
Now reform firm.
There were projects relating to the abduction of individuals, particularly members of radical groups. We were concerned about the convention in San Diego. Mr. Liddy had a plan where the leaders would be abducted and detained in a place like Mexico, and that they would then be returned to this country at the end of the convention. He had another plan which would have used women as agents to work with members of the Democratic National Committee and at their convention and here in Washington, and hopefully through their efforts they would obtain information from them.
Audience. I'm going to ask the audience to please refrain from laughing or any kind of demonstration.
With regard to the use of these women as agents, did this involve the use of a yacht in Miami?
he envisioned renting a yacht in Miami and having it set up for sound and photographs.
And what would the women be doing at that time?
I really could only estimate, but...
Well, based on his project, as your recollection,
well,
what did he indicate in this?
They would have been, I think you could consider them call girls.
Wait, I don't know what this is about. This is another one of these lead-through circles.
And although I was aware they were illegal, and I'm sure the others did, we had become somewhat inured to using some activities that would help us in accomplishing what we thought was a cause, a legitimate cause. Now, that's absolutely incorrect. Two wrongs do not make a right. For the past year, I've obviously had to consider that, and I understand completely that was an absolute incorrect decision. But that is basically, I think, the reason why that decision was made, because of that atmosphere that had occurred. And to all of us who had worked in the White House, there was that feeling of resentment and of frustration at being able to deal with issues on a legal basis.
When he says the frustration with having to deal with issues on a legal basis, he's meaning that they couldn't find out the information by using legitimate techniques. So they were proposing renting a yacht, using call girls to seduce Democrats to find out information about the opposing party's campaign. Now, I was in the interview when Magruder started talking about this, and I remember thinking, this is politics. They didn't teach this in college. You know? Anyway, Magruder was key and was in terms of managing the campaign while Mitchell was focused on broader strategy issues. But curiously, right after the break-in, the next morning, Magruder was reached while he was playing tennis with one of his friends. He immediately called Bob Reisner and Rob Odle, who were the two staff people that reported to him, and said, get rid of the chart that's in my office that's called the Gemstone Plan. And he wanted to basically destroy any evidence that indicated that he was aware of what was going to happen. He didn't tell us, he lied about it to us. So we had an interview with his administrative assistant, a fellow named Bob Reisner. And Bob, I got the task of interviewing Bob before we decided whether or not to use his testimony. It turns out that Bob also graduated from college in 1968. He went to Yale. I went to Princeton. He went to Harvard Business School. I ended up going to Harvard Law School. As I'm sitting there doing the interview, and he's coming across as a decent fellow who has just gotten caught up in something far bigger than him, I realized that there, but for the grace of God, go I. And how it just because of fate and circumstance, I'm sitting there interviewing him, and he's sort of a target, and I'm the investigator, where just as easily the tables could have been turned, and I'm not sure I would have had the wherewithal to tell the truth. Bob's contribution was that he did tell the truth about Magruder calling him to get rid of the chart of the Gemstone Plan.
Did you have any reason to believe that Reisner himself was part of the Gemstone Plan?
No, he was not. He was no part of the Gemstone.
So he was just given an errand.
Right. He was, yes. And the errand was very important from the standpoint of the testimony of Jeff Magruder. Here's a picture of Bob, and subsequently, he's actually become a personal friend. He's been a very successful consultant in Washington, primarily with the U.S. Postal Service of all places. And he's aged well, and he's a good guy from my perspective. But it was ironic.
Counsel will call the next witness.
Did you want to finish that?
Did you want to finish your point?
It was ironic. Your wife was getting clipped.
Just I wanted to point out the irony that here are two 25 or 26-year-olds in their first jobs, very similar, one on this side, one on the other side, as fate would have it.
What was the job? Can I just ask, what was the job Rob Reesner took? What was his title? I mean, why did he go to work for these guys if he had such a great pedigree?
He was what used to be called a liberal Republican who was very much into helping to create EPA. He worked in the executive office building prior to that and had been instrumental in creating EPA.
But this was a great job. I mean, he was, why not? He would be excited to be working for the committee to re-elect a man who he believed in. He's completely there in a legitimate.
So he moved from the White House to
Crete.
To Crete, right.
Okay.
And
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Good, Judge.
Right.
And it was a great honor, just like Lafferty leaves law school to go and work with someone he knew for 45 minutes, right? It was a crapshoot.
Right. It's just mind come
And you
up.
followed Blackbirds with a guy you knew for 45 minutes too?
That's right, and that was another crapshoot.
Yes.
Here's Bob Reed.
50
Council
years.
will call the next witness.
Will Mr. Robert Reesner take the witness chair, please?
Yeah. I'm so scared I'll whisper something. Yeah.
Here.
You stand up, hold up your right hand. You swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Terry Lenzner, Assistant Chief Counsel, will ask the first few questions of the witness.
Mr. Reesner, will you spell your name and address, please?
My name's Robert Reesner, middle initial AF. My address is 2727 29th Street in Northwest Washington.
Just 2 blocks from
Spell your last name, please.
It's Reisner.
And you're appearing here today without counsel, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have any short opening statement you'd like to make?
No, I don't. As you know, Mr. Lenzner, Mr. Chairman, I've met with your staff on a number of occasions in an effort to try to be as cooperative as I could be, and I'm appearing here in the same spirit, and I'll be glad to answer your questions as fully
And
as
I'd like
possible.
to say on behalf of the committee, the staff assures me that you have been most cooperative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I just wanted to show that we had some witnesses that were there solely for the purpose of creating a record undermining the testimony of other witnesses. And Magruder was one of the targets of the cover-up and the investigation, and he wasn't testifying truthfully. And we needed to put this in the record to sort of ensure that the prosecutors would charge him with perjury as well as the other crimes that he was accused of. Let me just stop it there for a second, because between Magruder's testimony and Reesner's testimony and the financial witnesses or the previous witnesses, we've now done a pretty good job of establishing a cover-up and establishing what the plan was in the first place that led to the Watergate break-in, the second break-in, and the cover-up. We then had a number of other witnesses before John Dean. What's happened behind the scenes is that Sam Dash has continued to meet with John Dean and his lawyer. Sam decides on his own, without any other satellite interviews or without any other inquiries, that we should grant Dean immunity to force his testimony. The special prosecutor objects to doesn't object. He has 20 days to file a statement with the court, and he has 10 days and then 20 days, so it's literally 30 days. If we grant Dean immunity, we can't have him testify for 30 days after that because of the procedures. So Sam has now brought in Fred Thompson and Howard Baker because Irvin agrees that we should grant Dean immunity. There's quite a discussion and quite a debate inside the committee on whether or not to grant Dean immunity. The Republicans are concerned that this is going to put all the focus on Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, which is what we want to do. And they don't want that to happen. So they are initially opposed to granting immunity to John Dean. We have a discussion at the executive committee and the full committee, and the vote once again is 5-2. What nobody realizes is that Lowell Weicker was living in the same apartment building as John Dean in Old Town Alexandria. John Dean had talked a lot with Weicker about what was going on and given him sort of an inside track from Dean's perspective of what was going on. Now, you may recall that Dean was initially charged with managing the cover-up. He was, in charge of the cover-up. Why did he all of a sudden turn state's evidence? Well, he suddenly realized that nobody in the White House was going to protect him, that neither Haldeman or Ehrlichman, not John Mitchell, not President Nixon, were about to protect John Dean. And he realized that he needed a lawyer. So he went out and found two lawyers, Charlie Schaefer and Bob McCandless. Bill, you were friends of Bob McCandless, right? And they very skillfully had him disgorge everything he knew into a statement. They then negotiated with the prosecutors to try and get Dean immunity. The prosecutors were not going to give him immunity because they thought he was the primary mover in the cover-up. So the prosecutors objected to our granting him immunity, but they isolated all the proof that they had prior to our grant that they could use in a trial to force Dean to subsequently plead guilty to a very lesser offense. We voted him immunity, and then before we could use his testimony, we had to wait 30 days for the prosecutors to file whatever objections they might have. They didn't have many. So what we ended up doing was having a number of other smaller fish witnesses like Bart Porter, who was the head of scheduling for the committee to re-elect the president, had been in the White House prior to going to Crete. We had Herb Kalmbach testify. He was the lawyer, we've talked about him this morning, who managed the funds for the cover-up and the payments to the defendants.
And additional funds too, because back to that Hughes Rebozo thing I was telling you about, Kalmbach also knew that they were hanging on to a couple $100,000, and he was trying to help Bibi Rebozo. This is a side story, but it was still going on. So this guy was involved at all sorts of different levels of what are they going to do with all this money that's sloshing around.
Right. It was, most campaigns are run on a shoestring budget. This campaign ran on floods of cash floating around, which is part of the reason we had all the reforms after Watergate that regulated political action committees and restricted the amount of money anybody could give and prohibited cash contributions. The other witness that was important for us was Hugh Sloan, who we've talked about. He was the treasurer of the committee to re-elect the president. And he was able to talk about the relationship of how he financed things versus how Herb Kalmbach was financing things. These were all leading to John Dean's testimony. And finally, when we got to John Dean in late June, it was the week before the July 4th recess, we finally, and there you have a good idea of what the caucus room looked like from where we were sitting at the front.
That's the back of Irvin's head.
Yes, that's Senator Irvin's there. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the immunity request and the debate. What Dean ultimately provided us with was a 245-page statement, written statement, typed statement, that not only described the 7 or 8 meetings that he had with President Nixon, but also told all the story of what his interactions were with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, and President Nixon. In the weekend before his testimony, it was around June 22nd or 23rd of 73. We had his testimony finally came to us that Saturday morning. our administrator decided that she was going to lock down the office all weekend, so that nobody could take documents out and nobody could bring documents in. We had 3 or 4 lawyers preparing for Dean's testimony over the weekend in the office. Terry and I had already interviewed John Mitchell in preparation for his testimony that was going to be after Dean and after some other witnesses. And we served him a subpoena for all his documents relevant to the campaign. He didn't have the documents available when we interviewed him, but Terry called me aside on Thursday or Friday and said, I want you to go up to New York this weekend while everybody's preparing for John Dean. I need you to go through all his Mitchell's documents up in New York. They're available this weekend, and he'll be there on Saturday and Sunday. Go up there and find out what you need.
Where was there?
There was at the Essex House in New York on 59th Street. Mitchell and Martha had an apartment in the Essex House. So early on that Saturday morning before Dean's testimony, I took the shuttle up to New York, went to the Essex House, went up to I think it was the 7th floor where his apartment was, knocked on the door, and John Mitchell, I'm going alone, I might add, which is really stupid in retrospect. You never do an interview alone. You never do anything alone in these circumstances because you want to make sure to have a witness that backs up your own testimony. And so I hadn't thought about that, and Terry hadn't said anything about that because we were also secretive and yet trying to share that it didn't make sense to bring somebody else along. Anyway, I went up. Mitchell showed me into his library, gave me a file cabinet that had 3 big file drawers full of documents, and I started going through the documents on Saturday. About 11 o'clock in the morning, he came back in and said, well, how are you almost finished? And I said, no, I just finished one drawer of a 3-drawer file cabinet. I'm going as fast as I can. And he said, well, I got a meeting I've got to get to. And I thought, well, this is just a ruse to move me along and get me out of the apartment building. So I said, well, I'll let you know when I finish. And I kept going on. I worked through lunch, and in the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, Mitchell comes back in and says, but I like a drink. And I'm thinking, I'm 26 years old.
So drink sounds good.
The former Attorney General of the United States is offering me a drink in his apartment while I'm searching through his documents to see if he's implicated in this cover-up and this break-in. I said, no, I didn't. He said, well, I hope you don't mind if I do. And he brought himself in a glass of scotch. And there was a rocker there in his office, in his library. And he starts to sit down on the rocker, and he sits on the edge of it, and it flips. And he falls down, spills the drink, and falls back and hits his head. And I, for a moment, have one of those classic panic attacks where I could see the headlines in the Daily News the next day. Watergate staffer kills former Attorney General. And that's when I realized I shouldn't have been up there alone, and I'm never going to do this again. So anyway, I'm not in the office until Sunday. I have a sheaf of documents that I've taken from his files that are relevant to the campaign. There's nothing particularly dramatic in any of them, but I want to take them to make sure that we have them for backup. So I fly back to Washington that night, Saturday night, with my sheaf of documents, and Sunday go into the office that is locked down to prevent any leaks. I show up at her offices Sunday morning with Mary, and Mary goes in, and there's no problem. And I walk in with my sheaf of documents to a lockdown office, and as I'm walking by and thanking the security guards who recognized me, and I'm holding these documents in my hand like this, walking down the aisle of the auditorium toward my office and what I'm doing is putting him in the cage. And our administrator comes shrieking down the aisle after me saying, "Mark, Mark, Mark." And I turn around and stop, and I'm holding these documents, and Laura, her name was Laura, says to me, "You know, the Rosenbergs did far less than what you've done, and they were executed for it." I hadn't realized that bringing a document into a lockdown was a violation of procedure. And so I had sort of a Hobson's choice in the sense that I had to put the documents in the cage to protect them, but I couldn't put the documents in the cage because of the lockdown. So if I kept them out, that was bad for security. And if I put them in, that was bad for security. Anyway, the documents went into the cage. We subsequently had testimony from Mitchell, which we'll cover next week. And John Dean's testimony, all 245 pages, was remarkable in the sense that it took him over 7 hours and literally 4 days of our hearing time to finish reading his testimony.
We're going to go through all of it now, so sit back.
I thought I'd spare all of you listening to John Dean reading his testimony.
So I have a question. I was surprised that Mitchell let you take documents out.
I know, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, well, that's procedure.
Leave it on the floor.
I mean, they were his documents. We would make copies and we'd send them back.
He knocked them out on the fingers on the floor.
That's exactly. But you know, as a sidebar, one of the things we were surprised by, especially as a comparison with what's going on today in similar situations, is that counsel on both sides were very cooperative.
Yeah. It was remarkable.
It was remarkable, and it's probably because, I don't know why.
There was a naivete, and people hadn't had much experience at dealing with this kind of congressional investigation.
Maybe they were still believing in the institution. Maybe they were still thinking we knew what we were doing.
So I've been wondering this whole time why you did not record these interviews.
The reason we didn't record the interviews.
There were all sorts of levels of information. Some would just be very informal. Some would just be interviews where you would take notes. And part of what we did before is you take the notes, you bring them back, you summarize them. They were typed up, then put it in a computer. So that was that. There was also something called an executive session. And those would be where you really wanted a hard record. And there would be a stenographer there. And the questions and the answers would be recorded. That was a different level. And I think you'll find with some of the higher up interviewees, they were in fact done in a recorded situation. So there were different levels of gravity. That's right. This was all Lackwitz was doing is picking up documents. Did you know you would go through it, or did you think you were just going to carry back what had been called?
I just thought I'd carry back what I called from the.
So you were surprised when you were told to go through the file cabinet?
I was what?
You were surprised when you were told to go through the file cabinet?
Oh,
did you think you were just a carrier?
I thought I was just getting documents. I wasn't going to interview Mitchell at the time.
That's what Maggie was saying. He was just going to shepherd these documents back to DC, but no, he was going to push the Attorney General out of his chair.
Yeah, Bob.
At any point, were you worried about what Mitchell may have put in that drink that he offered? You know, Jimmy Hoffa never asked what was in that drink either.
Right. He's the same place where Mitchell is.
Maybe he went in the room and was going to, you started a conversation that you might be worried that he might divulge something that you should have.
That's possible, but at the time, it was sort of a very strategic document retrieval, and because I didn't have any help with me, I didn't feel I should do an interview because it was just going to be my word against his.
He had already been interviewed.
But what would you have done if he'd sat down in that rocker with his drink and started spewing out all this information?
Yeah, well, that would have been great. I would have taken out my tape recorder probably and taped that, but I didn't need to because it didn't happen. Because I had to help him clean up the drink that was on the floor.
I thought he was
was gonna spill the scotch. I thought he waited until you had called documents and then he was gonna spill the scotch.
You guys have all seen way too many movies. This isn't a full guy code now.
I thought it was bad enough just being there by myself, I realized later on. And in fact, the plane coming back got delayed by 3 or 4 hours because of a storm. And so the whole day was kind of a blur in a sense. But then the next day it became comedy when I was accused of doing something worse than the Rosenberg by trying to put documents in our secret page. I mean, I thought...
Mark, was it just normal that people would keep documents at home in his own private library?
Well, after they'd served, yeah, it was. They could take, yeah, it was his personal files. They weren't official files, these were his personal files. So a lot of them were just copies of documents that were already in public domain.
What kind of documents were you looking for?
I was looking for any documents relating to the campaign that went from Mitchell to the campaign to Mitchell, from Magruder or Sloan or any of the Reason or any of the people at the committee that they were sending to.
Eleanor, it would establish a paper trail. You would have a date certain, a conversation reflected in the memo, or a request to do something or a response.
I was just wondering, or maybe it was just his personal archive, that's was a question, or a formal paper.
Well, I think it's a good question as to why would he have these documents in his apartment? And maybe Creep had already been shut down. Maybe he took them to preserve the documents. I don't know.
This is way after. This is in '73.
Right.
The committee doesn't exist.
So he may have kept these documents because they were part of
the campaign history.
Yeah, I bet that.
Which they were quite proud of.
Yeah.
Because it was a landslide.
Yeah, good point. Shall we hear Dean?
Not quite yet. Not quite yet. The key with Dean was not only the 7 meetings he had with President Nixon. What we didn't know at the time was that the White House, what the Democrats didn't know at the time, the White House had provided a summary from their perspective of what each of these meetings consisted of. And it was a document that was sent up to the Republicans while Dean was testifying. But we didn't see it until much later. And so the key from our perspective was Dean talking about his meeting with Richard Nixon in September of 1972, when the president congratulated him on keeping the investigation away from the White House. And he responded that he wasn't sure how long that was going to be able to hold up. There were 6 other meetings between September and the end of March, one of which he told President Nixon that there was a cancer growing on the presidency. And President Nixon at the time wandered over to the fireplace in the old executive office building, and Dean suspected that maybe he was speaking into a microphone and maybe that office was bugged. Now, that was the first suggestion that anybody had made, that maybe the White House was bugged. And so inadvertently, but partly because of Dean's suggestion, is how we got on to discovering the taping system inside the White House. Let's go to the next, go to the next. This will be some of Dean's testimony. We only pulled out a little bit of.
Dean III.
Stand up and raise your right hand.
Bob McCann was behind him, though.
I received a call requesting me to come to the President's Oval Office. When I arrived at the Oval Office, I found Mr. Haldeman, the President, and the President. The President asked me to sit down. Both men appeared to be in very good spirits, and my reception was warm and cordial. The President then told me that Bob, referring to Mr. Haldeman, had kept him posted on my handling of the Watergate case. The President told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the President was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy. I responded that I could not take credit because others had done much more difficult things than I had done. As the President discussed the present status of the situation, I told him that all I had been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House. I also told him that there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and that I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would not start to unravel. I left the meeting with the impression that the President was well aware of what had been going on regarding the success of keeping the White House out of the Watergate scandal, and I had also expressed to him my concern that I was not confident that the cover-up could be maintained indefinitely.
So that was part of his testimony. He also testified about 6 other meetings he had and painted a pretty damning picture of Haldeman's involvement, Ehrlichman's involvement, and John Mitchell's involvement, the first 2 in the cover-up and the latter in the break-in itself. I'm sorry, did you have a question? No. Oh, okay. And as I said, his testimony took up an entire week of our hearings, and it was right before the July 4th recess that Congress always takes in the summertime. And our switchboard lit up with calls from people that thought Dean was telling the truth, from people that thought Dean was lying, and what we ended up having was a struggle between both sides about whether Dean was being a truthful witness or not, which is how we get on to some of the other leads that take us finally to Alexander Butterfield.
And just an interjection, a reminder, at the time that Dean is testifying, this long 4 days of testimony, it's filled with loads and loads of detail. He has dates, he knows who's in the room. He is an extraordinary witness, and some would think too extraordinary. How is it possible that anybody can remember all of this? And so there was a suspicion, a strongly held suspicion, that he's just fabricating the whole damn thing. And he's constructing through his memory a scenario that's going to merely make him an active player, but not the orchestrator that everyone has been strongly suggesting that he was. It's only later on that you're going to find out that everything this dude has been talking about is verified in the tapes. But we don't know about the tapes that Dean's testimony. We just know that there's a witness filled with specific information.
Well, in fact, after he delivered his testimony, the Republicans and the senators, Republican senators, spent a lot of time in cross-examination trying to shake his testimony and poke holes in it. It turns out that they thought they hid some pay dirt with respect to the Mayflower coffee shop. Dean testified about meeting with Kalmbach and meeting with Jack Caulfield at the Mayflower coffee shop. And one of the Republican investigators went over to the Mayflower hotel and discovered they didn't have a coffee shop. And so they made a big deal about pointing out that there was no Mayflower coffee shop. And we got a call to the committee from somebody out there in the public who said, in essence, the Statler Hilton Hotel has a coffee shop that's called the Mayflower Coffee Shop. What they thought was going to be a very effective cross-examination turned out to actually support our belief that he was basically telling the truth. And the president had maintained that he had no knowledge of any of this till Dean brought him this news in March. And Dean was already testifying that as early as September of '72, he was already aware of it. So there was quite a battle royale over John Dean. And let me pause there to see if there.
That's it. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
How early
Maggie.
on did he use the word cover up?
How what?
How early on did he use the word cover up?
Dean used the word cover up when we talked to him right from the beginning.
So he knew exactly what he was revealing and what he was
Yes.
doing.
Yeah, well, he'd been managing it.
Right.
And it had been his baby. So yes, he did reveal it. Other questions about John Dean? Let's go to the other video with his reflections on why he.
I don't think we have any.
Yeah, we do. Yes, it's the last one.
I beg your pardon. Yes, we do.
John, thank you so much for doing this. We can stop anytime you want. If you think something, edit yourself.
Got it.
That's it. Nope.
I went to the Nixon White House to work because I was at the Justice Department. I had been selected to be the number 13 man in about a 35,000 lawyer department and was serving as the Associate Deputy Attorney General. In that post, I did a lot of work with the White House staff, and particularly with the press, because my bosses, the Attorney General John Mitchell and the Deputy Attorney General Dick Kleindienst, did not like to do backgrounders at the White House. They found I was a pretty fast study on these subjects, and so they sent me over to do a lot of these backgrounders. That's when I started working with the White House with John Ehrlichman, Bud Krogh, and the Domestic Council. And when Ehrlichman became the assistant to the president, leaving the White House counsel chair open, that's when they asked me to come over and take the job. I actually played a little hard to get. I had friends at the White House who I realized were working around the clock with little reward. So I was pretty sure what the job would be before I took the job. And they really persuaded me. I didn't realize until decades later, when I saw all the vetting they had done on me, the people they had sent to kind of privately interview me and see if they thought I'd fit in, which they did. And when they finally offered the job, they flew me out to California and helicoptered me down to San Clemente, and the president asked me to take the job, and that's pretty hard to turn down at that point. When I first asked my boss, John Mitchell, whether he thought I should take the job, both he and Kleindienst told me not to take the job. Dick Kleindienst was rather explicit. He said, I wouldn't work at that zoo up the street if I was being paid 5 times what I am now. So I got some feedback initially that to be careful about going up there. Mitchell said to me, though, he said, I can understand at your age and at your position, while you'll go up here in the department, the title of counsel of the president is hard to not want on your resume. And that really was what sold me. The first time I did meet Nixon is when he offered me the job.
What did you think of him?
When I walked in his office in San Clemente, he was rather theatrically looking out over the Pacific. He was wearing a casual sport jacket, and Haldeman and I sat down in the office before he turned and sort of dramatically came over and introduced himself. But it was, from the very beginning, I thought how theatrical he was with guests. And even once I did become a member of the staff, I noticed that was a trend, that he staged often appearances in the Oval Office. Not when you became a regular working staffer. You'd walk in and he'd have his feet on the desk and look at you around his shoes. But first impressions, he certainly played it up in the Oval Office and his other offices. First, I must say, I really wasn't in the inner circle at the White House. I have, out of Nixon's totality of meetings each day, I have roughly 37 meetings with Nixon. They happen to be very key meetings later in history. But I was a middle-level staff guy as White House counsel. I reported through my predecessor, John Ehrlichman, or the Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman. And typically my dealings with Nixon were in groups, or I was in there with several other people. And it was very late in the game before I start having one-on-one with Nixon. And that's after he's been reelected, and he really doesn't want Haldeman and Ehrlichman being consumed by Watergate, so he wants to get it directly from me, knowing They're coming to me to get updates because I've become sort of the desk officer on this issue and gathering all the information. So that's when I started having one-on-ones with Nixon. But I have definite impressions about the way the White House worked from the assignments I was given, the questions I was asked, and I would say that Richard Nixon had great difficulty with the press and the media in general, the Washington Post in particular. That was quite evident to anybody who worked there. I don't think any president is very happy with negative coverage. And Nixon always had a well he could draw from and drew deeply throughout his career. So it probably is part of it was with the job, part of it was from his own background where he felt that because of his education was not Ivy League, and he often thought that the press, particularly the columnists who were critical of him, were looking down on him. So there was no question that played into it. I never heard that. As it happens, I've listened to literally hundreds of tapes for one of my books, and you certainly get it in listening to tape after tape. But from my personal meetings, I didn't get much of it. There was one notable conversation in one of my first Watergate-related meetings on September 15th of 1972, the day that the burglars and who were arrested in the Watergate, and Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, their handlers, were all indicted for the Watergate break-in. And in that conversation, after talking briefly about the arrests, Nixon talks about how he is going to tee off on the press during his second term. He's very confident he's going to win re-election. It, to me, is one of my probably the only embarrassing conversation I have with Nixon when I later listen to it. I'm new to it, and I really sort of brown nose and say, "Oh, that sounds great, Mr. President," because I know that's what he wants to hear. None of my other conversations did I play that way with him. Being as young as I was, I'm in my early 30s. Here's a man who's been vice president. He is president. I had to be very careful. I didn't know what he knew. I initially don't think we have any trouble, and realize by the time I start dealing with him, we're in a lot of trouble, and have tried to convince my colleagues we're in a lot of trouble. And I don't carry a lot of good news into him at that point, and I play it very straight with him. So after the September 15th conversation, which is fairly early in Watergate, if you will, as opposed to my later conversations, I pull no punches with him. In fact, it gets down where I really am trying to warn him and frighten him, if you will, to do the right thing.
Yeah.
The Pentagon Papers were published the weekend of the Tricia Nixon wedding, and I became aware of the president's reaction on Monday following the weekend of the wedding, and the Sunday in which the headline of the release on the New York Times of this Vietnam study, when it was on the front page of my paper as well, and I got a call from Ehrlichman in the Oval Office wanting to know if the administration can prosecute the New York Times for this leak. And I said, for what? He said, well, how about treason? And I said, well, I don't think this is treason, and I also don't think it's the policy of the Department of Justice to run this kind of prosecution, but I'll make some calls and get back to you, which I did. I actually called Bill Rehnquist, who was the Assistant Attorney General, the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, later a Chief Justice, who was out. But his office sent back a very quick memo saying, yes, they could be prosecuted, but no, it was not the policy of the Department of Justice to launch this kind of prosecution. I wasn't involved in the decision to go to the Supreme Court and try to enjoin the Times, and really had little more than newspaper knowledge of that. I was White House counsel at that point. I had the title of White House counsel. John Ehrlichman gave up the title. He never gave up the position. I reported to two people. I reported to John Ehrlichman, who had been White House counsel, and I reported to Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff. Liddy was brought, I think Liddy was already on the staff when the Pentagon Papers were released. I hadn't met Liddy at that time. During the time and shortly after the release of the Pentagon Papers, a fellow by the name of Jack Caulfield came in my office. He said, I just came from Chuck Colson's office. Colson wants me to firebomb the Brookings Institute. I said, wait a minute, give that to me again. He said, he wants me to firebomb the Brookings Institute. I said, what are you talking about, Jack? He said, yes, he wants me to firebomb it, and when the fire department responds, I'm to send in a team of burglars to get papers out of the safe in the Brookings that the president thinks belong to the government. I said, Jack, this is crazy. Do nothing. Do nothing. And I then flew to San Clemente because I wasn't going to debate this on the phone with anybody, and went in and told Ehrlichman. I said, this is crazy, John. By that time, I'd pulled down the D.C. code and realized if there's a death as a result of arson, it was a capital crime at that point. So I wanted to be loaded with at least some law, and went out and told Ehrlichman the story, and he said, he picked up the phone. He called Colson. He said, Colson, young Counsel Dean is out here, doesn't think the Brookings is a very good idea. Cancel it. I learned later, as a result of my doing that, when they set up the plumbers unit to investigate Ellsberg and other leaks, they were specifically told not to tell me what they were doing. Bud Krogh, who was one of the persons who set it up, explained to me, he said, John, a lot of people around here think there's some little old lady in you. Well, I wish there had been more little old lady in a lot of people around there, but I don't think it was a sign of little old lady, of just being sane. And I had no trouble in dealing with issues like that. So that was my first inkling of how far this thing might go. Today I know, from listening to the tapes, on 3 occasions, Nixon tells Haldeman to break into Brookings. He's not getting satisfaction, so he picks up the phone and calls Colson and tells Colson to do it. It's Liddy who cooks up the scheme to have his Cuban Americans that he is working with, and will later break in the Watergate with, dress up as firemen, and they will buy a fire truck, and they'll go over and start this fire and pretend like they too are firemen entering the building, and in the confusion they'll get in the safe. I mean, it was outrageous, the whole scheme. So I didn't know until many, many years later this was Gordon Liddy's idea, but not untypical of his thinking.
All right, then.
All right. Well, I thought that would add some color. Rich?
How much longer? When was that tape made? Is that 10 years later? 15?
This tape was made about, what was it, 5 years, a couple of years ago.
I think it was the 50-year anniversary. You know, you're seeing Dean age
22.
Still a great memory.
22. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's quite a bit.
Oh, quite a bit.
Okay. And next week, we're going to finish with the discovery of the White House tapes. The chronology after that was discovered, and then open it up for discussion about then and now. Did the system work, or were we just lucky?
Right, and it's meant to be discussion.
It's meant to be, so-
if you're seeing some parallels or whatever, it's an open.
I think history just keeps repeating itself.
It's never the same.
Anyway, thank you for your attention, and see you next week.
Yeah, all right.